Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about some news that came out a couple days ago saying that Loki, the Disney Plus show, will actually connect into Doctor Strange 2, aka Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness, which is interesting on many different levels because prior to this, we already knew that WandaVision would play a heavy role into Doctor Strange 2 simply because Wanda is also going to pop up in it, but whatever goes down in WandaVision is going to play a key role going into Doctor Strange 2. But I guess in my head, I was under the impression that Loki was kind of going to be its own thing of just like, oh, but I guess they went out of their way, they're making this a TV show and everything, so obviously it must have some significance. When we actually think about it in the grand scheme of things, every other show has significance in the MCU because obviously Falcon and the Winter Soldier is obviously setting up, you know, potentially like some villain stuff as well as some story stuff that can be carried over into the main, you know, overarching MCU, but also like what is, you know, it's more story for Bucky and Sam. Obviously Sam now being the new Captain America, stepping up into that role. Obviously we talked about WandaVision and everything that's got to do with Vision himself, so that's got to be something that's also going to be carried over. Hawkeye is potentially setting up Kate Bishop as the new Hawkeye, so that has to be considered as well. And then there's all the other shows, whether it be Miss Marvel, because she could be the setup for introducing Inhumans into the MCU, She-Hulk, Hulk passing on the torch to someone else. Obviously Moon Knight, we can get a more heavily vigilante layered character, well, complex vigilante character into the MCU as well. So it also makes you wonder, would the what if have any implications as well? I mean, that seems like it's supposed to, it seems like it is definitely the most disconnected, where it's kind of just supposed to be its own thing, but you know, we'll see whether or not they end up pointing out the fact is that even though it's kind of its own thing, there might be little references and nods to it. In particular, especially when we get to like the Multiverse of Madness, like there might be winks and nods towards some of the stuff we see potentially in What If. But like I was saying, I was under the impression like Loki might be its own thing, but to be fair, this has been kind of a long setup thing. I mean, they went through the trouble of setting the story up in Endgame, and now it seems like, okay, so you're keeping this villain Loki around, but you're putting him under different circumstances of this being the Loki from Avengers, who's still a bad guy, who hasn't gone through all the story progression that he went through over the course of, I guess, what we consider like the main canon of the MCU, non-including, you know, alternate timelines and stuff like that. So, and I guess that's another aspect to this too, because I guess in my head when I'm thinking multiverse, I'm not thinking alternate timelines. I guess I treat multiverse, like other worlds, other kind of alternate universes differently than alternate timelines, even though they can be the same thing. Because like when I think multiverse, I think of the Flash, where it's like, oh, here's Earth 1, here's Earth 2, whereas, you know, this, like I said, it's an alternate timeline. It's a split timeline of like, but it's an alternate timeline, so it still kind of counts as an alternate world. So I guess that storyline would, of course, fold into the multiverse of madness, especially if we don't know, you know, because it all depends on what kind of shenanigans Loki gets up to, because obviously he's screwing with history, but maybe it'd be a twisted thing where it's like, hey, he ends up destroying that universe and he hops over to another universe. I mean, because you also have to think of the implications of like everything that's resolved in this timeline isn't resolved in that one. Like Thanos isn't, well, because it depends on how screwed up Loki makes the timeline in an alternate reality. But I just think it was such a fascinating discussion on its own of just like finding that out. Like I said, like I had to, because the big conversation that's come out of this has been like, well, obviously the news has always come out that like, hey, these TV shows, unlike everything previously, like, you know, whether it be the stuff on Netflix, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I've always talked about, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has had a one-way connection to the MCU where it's like it would reference the movies, but the movies were never referenced, and that's a whole thing. Well, the whole conversation recently has been like, well, a lot of people were like, oh, we knew they'd be connected, but they didn't realize. The way the conversation has been more recently is like they're essential for understanding these future movies. So that's been the conversation, and I think for some people they probably underestimated how connected everything would be, that they are essentially essential. My mind was always keen that no, they're essential, especially when you look at Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It's like there's going to be so much plot from that won't make sense, because probably by the end of that you're going to be like, oh, Sam becomes Captain America. He fully embraces and becomes Captain America, and then when next time you see him pop up in the movies, like, oh, he's Captain America. I was like, oh, I guess that's something that happened in between. It's like, no, there's a whole bunch of story that you missed in that regard, you know, so that's the whole thing. Because this is the whole conversation I've talked about before of like connecting everything together. People will use the term like homework has gotten used for it. This is something I've talked about a couple years ago about the whole Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. thing, because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was never connected, but the way someone kind of put it to me, my understanding was, well, you're asking people to not only be invested in movies, but like full-blown series. I mean, especially look at Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It is basically 22 hour-long episodes, really like 40-some minutes, obviously if you're not counting commercial breaks. 20-some hour-long episodes across 5 seasons, and obviously season 6 being 13, and season 7, the final season, going to be 13 as well. So that's a lot for someone you're asking someone to keep up with. Now the same thing could be said about the Disney Plus stuff, but the understanding is that the Disney Plus stuff is more so they're going to be shorter shows and they're going to be a lot more budgeted. But because it seems like, because I think the whole thing is like some people are thinking maybe the Disney Plus stuff is going to be supplementary, but in actuality it is necessary. But I don't know, that comes down to how it all folds into each other, because it could be a thing of, oh, like you could be fine, but I think you'd be missing out so much on good story and character development if you miss out, especially because the whole conversation is that these shows are going to be so different too. Because an example is like, I didn't even think about comparing it, but like when we get WandaVision, we might be getting some Legion type of feel. If you've never seen Legion, I highly recommend you check it out. It's a great superhero show. It's very different from any other superhero show. And I think we're going to get that with each of the Disney Plus shows, because like Falcon and Winter Soldier is going to be like action spike. They'll look much like Winter Soldier. Hawkeye, not really sure what to really kind of make of that. That might be just kind of a more like dramatic drama. Loki is going to be like a very like fantasy, like, oh, we're skipping through time and just shenanigans ensue, and what that means for Loki as a character. So there's so much there that like it's that thing of like, just because you're invested in the MCU might not necessarily translate to the TV shows, because that doesn't necessarily translate to everything else. But the argument could be because everything else, whether it be, like I said, the stuff on Netflix, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Cloak and Dagger, Runaways, all of that might not have the necessary, because a lot of people are like, well, that's not connected. Some people might look at it as, well, it's TV show, they're going to be lower budget. I mean, and that's always been the whole thing about, like, it's a conversation I've had before about superhero fatigue. Like, I've yet to read superhero fatigue, because, like, I pretty much consume most things superhero. I'd say like 95% of things superhero. There's some stuff that has slipped through the cracks in certain regards, but more often than not, I feel like I've kind of watched everything. But maybe people would have checked out everything else if they knew ahead of time of like, oh, these are all connected, because it was always pretty clear. I mean, and maybe that's the thing of just because I'm slightly more knowledgeable. Maybe the average person is just kind of like, I'm invested in the movies. I don't care about TV show. Even if you had told them back then that everything that I've listed before was part of the MCU, which once again, it always was, but it was tangentially connected. Maybe that's still wasn't enough to get the average viewer to, like, obviously, and it's the term that kind of gets used, like the hardcore fans are, like, I consider myself a bit of a hardcore fan because I watch everything. It's not even just a thing of like, it's just, because at this point I've come to know that, like, hey, the movies and the TVs are separate. Those were separate things until recently, because obviously with Kevin Feige becoming CCO of Marvel, the fact of the matter is that he oversees both the movies and the TV shows now. So obviously, while we're kind of pulling everything ultimately together now, so it's a bit of a different conversation than before, but I still think that a lot of that still kind of applies to hardcore people. Will definitely watch, people like myself, but then like you get the average person and like, I'm invested in the movies, because you also have to think about, well, there's the people who are hardcore in the movies, but even then there's also people who are just like, I watch some of the movies, I'm slightly interested, but not everything interests me. So it's a very complicated situation. I'm kind of interested to see, like, what the whole situation is going to look like going forward. Like I said, Marvel's in this very interesting, unique situation, much like DC's in kind of its own unique situation of like, we got all these different universes. You got the movies and, whatever ends up happening with that. You got the Arrowverse, you got the DC Universe stuff, but at the same time, it's also like, don't forget, they're also pumping out like animated movies too, which are kind of like their own thing as well. So DC's kind of put themselves in a situation of like, we can kind of fiddle with all these different universes in our own right. Whereas like Marvel is trying to pull everything together, which is going to lead to some interesting things, which has always been my conversation of, and it's a conversation I've heard other people reflect. At the very least, bring everything else Marvel-wise, whether it be Cloak and Dagger, the Netflix stuff, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Runaways, bring that into the fold. Like, you don't have to like like be so heavy, like it doesn't have to be as directly connected as like, you know, the future Disney Plus stuff, but at least bring that continuity into the fold, because I don't want that, because that stuff has kind of been off on the wayside. It's kind of been pushed aside of just like, oh, you're your own thing for so long, and eventually it's going to be basically cut off from the MCU as a whole. Eventually being like, you know, it's going to turn into Star Wars stuff of like, oh, all that other Marvel stuff, all that Agent Shield, yeah, that's not canon anymore, which obviously we're already reaching that level, especially because where Agents of Shield is contradicts where the MCU currently is with the whole, you know, blip situation. So it's a whole complicated thing, but I want them to be able to fold that into the MCU in some shape or form. That might lead to them having to retcon certain things. I mean, because at least this way, it's like, hopefully we can start like even getting stuff from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of thrown in, because that's been my conversation before, because it's like what I brought up, you know, Miss Marvel, setting her up as being like the first Inhuman, which is like, which is, once again, it's like, that's a little shitty, because like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. introduced the Inhumans, like two prominent, you know, Inhumans I keep referencing, Quake and Yo-Yo, and like, are you just gonna drop them entirely and not reference them? That's a whole thing. But it's like, I want you to be able to at least wink and nod, but once again, it turns into that thing of like, you're asking people to do a lot of homework, but it's a whole thing. It depends on how invested you're gonna make certain things. Are you gonna make it so that something like, you know, winks and nods to the TV shows going forward, you could do something like that? But does that mean you would never fully bring it in? Like, for example, Daredevil. Like, obviously there's been talks about some of the Netflix stuff of people wanting to bring that in. Maybe they never get another shot as TV shows, but they'd be brought into the fold, and you could pull those characters. You just probably would maybe retcon some of their continuity, or maybe at the very least you'd reference all that happened, but we're not going forward with new shows. You know, I personally, I've made it clear, I'm like, as long as you don't reboot those properties, I'm fine, but maybe they would just to fit things. But once again, it's like, well, there's a Hulu situation. Like, if you want to continue those properties, which maybe at this point in time they feel like they wouldn't want to, Hulu presents an opportunity for you to keep them the mature shows that they are without, you know, having to change them into something more TV-14 appropriate to kind of fit more so the Disney model, kind of being at least somewhat family friendly along the lines of the PG-13 rating, you know? It's a very interesting circumstance, like I said, and you know, it's just, I kind of went on this bit of a tangent just because of, you know, where I started out with this whole Loki thing, but it all brings itself into a very interesting conversation that I've had time and time again, but I kind of wanted to bring that conversation up even more just because of, like, you know, this whole Loki conversation. So at the end of the day, this is just kind of what's rattling off in my brain. I'd love to get to know what your thoughts are about this, especially learning, you know, kind of going back to the original thing of Loki connecting into the MCU. Does that make you happy to know, like, oh, that isn't just kind of like a, oh, fun little side adventure? It's like, no, that's going to have implications going forward for the MCU as a whole, but definitely starting with Doctor Strange 2 being the first step. It's definitely going to be interesting when we ultimately get there to see, like, what that, because I think that's going to be the first movie that really ripples across the MCU, because it has so many implications of introducing the multiverse, of what that can introduce, what characters it could potentially introduce, you know, because like some thoughts has been like, well, could that be the way they introduce the X-Men? That's been my thought process for a while, but maybe that won't be the route. I've even heard some people suggest that the Eternals might be how they go about introducing the X-Men, which Eternals comes out before, actually way before Doctor Strange. So we'll ultimately have to wait and see. All this is just conjecture at this point in time. We'll ultimately have to wait and see when the Disney Plus shows come out, and eventually when the movies come out, to see where all the chips lie. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, a little to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.